The sky over Nevada was a bruised shade of purple, the kind that promised a storm but held its breath as if waiting for something extraordinary. Lieutenant Sarah Blaze Callahan stood on the tarmac, her flight suit snug against her frame, her helmet tucked under one arm. Her dark eyes scanned the horizon, not for threats, but for a sign. Something to confirm that what she was about to do was worth the risk. At 28, she was one of the youngest pilots ever cleared to fly the F-22 Raptor, a machine so advanced it seemed to hum with a life of its own. But today, the jet wasn't just a weapon or a marvel of engineering. It was her ticket to rewriting a story that had gone terribly wrong. Sarah had grown up in a small town in Ohio, where the fields stretched wide and the dreams were often small. Her father, a mechanic, taught her to fix engines before she could drive, and her mother, a nurse, showed her how to mend hearts with a kind word or a steady hand. They were the kind of people who gave without expecting anything back, who believed that kindness was its own reward. Sarah carried that with her, even into the Air Force, where the world was all sharp edges and high stakes. She'd earned her call sign Blaze not for recklessness but for the fire in her spirit, a quiet, steady burn that made her the pilot others trusted when everything went to hell. But hell had come in a way she hadn't expected. It started with a classified briefing 3 days ago, in a windowless room at Nellis Air Force Base. Colonel Marcus Reed, a man with a face like weathered granite, had laid it out plain. A humanitarian crisis was unfolding in a remote region of Eastern Europe, a place called Varnja, where a sudden famine had left thousands stranded without food or medicine. The geopolitics were messy. Sanctions, border disputes, and a local regime that didn't take kindly to foreign intervention. The U.S. had offered aid, but the delivery was stalled by bureaucracy and threats of retaliation. Drones were too slow, cargo planes too vulnerable. The situation was deteriorating and the clock was ticking. Sarah had listened, her jaw tight, as Reed explained why the Air Force couldn't act. "We're grounded by politics," he'd said, his voice heavy with frustration. "No one's willing to risk an international incident." She'd nodded, saluted, and left the room, but the images from the briefing, children with hollow eyes, families huddled under tarps, stayed with her. That night she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking of her mother, who'd once driven through a blizzard to deliver medicine to a neighbor. "You don't wait for permission to do what's right," her mother used to say. By dawn, Sarah had a plan. It was insane, of course. Stealing an F-22 wasn't just a career ender. It was a one-way ticket to a court-martial. Maybe worse. The jet was a $350 million piece of hardware, guarded by layers of security and protocol. But Sarah wasn't thinking about the cost or the consequences. She was thinking about the people in Varnja, about the food and medicine sitting in a hangar 50 miles away, and about the fact that no one else was going to move fast enough to save them. She'd always believed in the power of one person to make a difference, even when the world screamed that it was impossible. The plan came together in fragments, whispered conversations with people she trusted. There was Tech Sergeant Javier Jinx Morales, a wiry guy with a knack for bypassing security systems and a heart bigger than his bravado. He'd grown up in a rough part of Chicago where survival meant helping your own, no questions asked. When Sarah told him what she needed, he'd grinned and said, "You're gonna get us both locked up, Blaze, but I'm in." Then there was Dr. Emily Chen, a civilian contractor who'd been prepping the medical supplies for Varnja. Emily was quiet, meticulous, but she'd seen the same images Sarah had, and her hands shook with the same anger. "If you can get the plane," she'd said, "I'll get the cargo." The hardest part was convincing Captain Tom Hawk Larson, Sarah's wingman and the closest thing she had to family in the Air Force. Tom was by the book, a farm boy from Nebraska who believed in duty above all else. When she told him her plan to load an F-22 with medical supplies and food, fly it into restricted airspace, and drop the cargo over Varnja, he'd stared at her like she'd lost her mind. "You're talking about treason," he'd said, his voice low. But Sarah had looked him in the eye and said, "I'm talking about saving lives. You in or out?" He'd cursed, paced, and finally nodded. "If you crash, I'm not writing your eulogy." Now, standing on the tarmac, Sarah felt the weight of their trust. The F-22 loomed behind her, its sleek lines glinting under the floodlights. Jinx had worked his magic, disabling the tracking systems and fudging the logs to buy them a few hours. Emily had overseen the loading of the jet's modified weapons bay, where missiles had been replaced with tightly packed crates of antibiotics, bandages, and high-calorie rations. The math was tight. The F-22 wasn't built for cargo, and the weight would push the jet to its limits, but Sarah had run the numbers. It could work. It had to. The first sign of trouble came as she climbed into the cockpit. A security jeep screeched to a halt and Colonel Reed stepped out, his face a storm cloud. "Callahan," he barked, striding toward her. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Sarah froze, her hand on the canopy. She'd known this moment might come, but she'd hoped to be airborne before it did. She turned to face him, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "People are dying, sir," she said. "I'm taking the supplies to Varnja." Reed's eyes narrowed. "You're throwing away your career. You'll be court-martialed, maybe imprisoned, and for what? A stunt that might not even work?" "It's not a stunt," Sarah said. "It's a choice. I can't sit by while kids starve." He stared at her, and for a moment, she saw something flicker in his eyes, respect maybe or regret, but then he shook his head. "I can't let you do this. Stand down, Lieutenant. That's an order." Sarah hesitated, her mother's words echoing in her mind. "You don't wait for permission to do what's right." She looked at Reed, at the man who'd mentored her, who'd pinned her wings on her chest. "I'm sorry, sir," she said softly. Then she swung into the cockpit, slammed the canopy shut, and fired up the engines. The roar of the F-22's twin Pratt & Whitney engines drowned out Reed's shouts. The jet lurched forward, taxiing toward the runway as security scrambled. Sarah's hands moved on instinct, flipping switches, checking systems. Her heart was a drumbeat, but her mind was clear. She wasn't just a pilot now, she was a lifeline. The tower's voice crackled in her headset. "Raptor 1, you are not cleared for takeoff. Abort immediately." Sarah ignored it, pushing the throttle forward. The jet surged, pinning her to the seat as the runway blurred beneath her. Alarms blared. Someone had activated the base's lockdown protocol, but it was too late. The F-22 lifted off, its nose pointed toward the sky, and Sarah felt a rush of freedom, of purpose that she'd never known before. The flight to Varnja was a gauntlet. She flew low to avoid radar, skimming mountains and valleys, the jet's stealth systems her only shield against detection. The weight of the cargo made the controls sluggish, and every turbulence felt like a warning. But Sarah didn't falter. She thought of the faces in the briefing photos, of the children who'd never know her name but might live because of her. She thought of her parents, of Jinx and Emily and Tom, who'd risked everything to help her. This wasn't about glory or rebellion. It was about humanity, about doing what was right when the world said it was impossible. Halfway across the Atlantic, she picked up a tail. 2 unidentified jets, likely from a neighboring country's air force, patrolling the edge of restricted airspace. Her radio crackled with warnings in a language she didn't understand, but the tone was clear: turn back or be shot down. Sarah's pulse spiked, but she kept her voice calm as she responded in English. "This is a humanitarian mission," she said. "I'm carrying food and medicine for Varnja. Let me through." Silence followed, stretching so long she thought they hadn't understood. Then, to her shock, one of the jets peeled off, and the other took position beside her, not as a threat but as an escort. She couldn't see the pilot's face, but she imagined them weighing the same choice she had: duty versus humanity. For reasons she'd never know, they chose the latter. When she reached Varnja, the sun was rising, painting the sky gold. The drop zone was a patchwork of fields and tents, a desperate sprawl of humanity below. Sarah opened the weapons bay and the crates fell, parachutes blooming like white flowers against the dawn. She circled once, watching the supplies land, watching people run toward them, their faces alight with hope. Her chest ached with something she couldn't name: relief maybe, or love. The return flight was quieter, the weight of the cargo gone, but the weight of what she'd done settling in. She knew what awaited her at Nellis: handcuffs, questions, consequences. But as she guided the F-22 back across the ocean, she felt no regret. She'd done what she set out to do. She'd changed something, even if it was just one corner of the world. When she landed, the tarmac was swarming. Security, MPs, and Reed, his face unreadable. Sarah climbed out of the cockpit, her legs unsteady, and faced him. "I did what I had to do," she said, her voice firm. Reed didn't speak for a long moment. Then, to her surprise, he nodded. "You're a hell of a pilot, Callahan," he said. "And a hell of a person." The fallout was messy. There were hearings, investigations, headlines. Some called her a hero, others a rogue. The Air Force couldn't condone what she'd done, but they couldn't ignore the lives she'd saved either. In the end, she was grounded, her wings clipped, but the story of her flight spread. It sparked debates, inspired aid organizations, and pushed governments to act. Varnja got more help, and the famine eased. Sarah's name became a whisper, a symbol of what one person could do when they chose kindness over fear. Years later, Sarah stood in a field in Ohio, not far from where she'd grown up. She was no longer a pilot, but she was a teacher, working with kids who reminded her of herself, dreamers with fire in their hearts. She'd married Tom, who'd never let her live down the fact that she'd dragged him into her crazy plan. Jinx sent her postcards from wherever he was stationed, always with a joke about owing him a beer. Emily had started a nonprofit, delivering aid to places the world forgot. One evening, a letter arrived, postmarked from Varnja. It was from a woman named Anna, who'd been a child when the crates fell from the sky. "You gave us more than food," she wrote. "You gave us hope." Sarah read the letter under the stars, her eyes wet, her heart full. She'd lost her wings, but she'd gained something greater, the knowledge that one act of selflessness could ripple across the world, changing everything. Sarah folded the letter from Anna and tucked it into her pocket, the paper already soft from rereading. The Ohio field was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt alive with crickets and the rustle of cornstalks. She leaned against the fence, the stars above her sharp and endless, and let the weight of the letter settle in her chest. It wasn't just words on paper. It was proof that her choice, that one reckless flight, had reached further than she'd ever imagined. She'd always known the world could be cruel, but now she knew it could be kind too if you gave it a push. Back at Nellis, the aftermath of her flight had been a storm of its own. The media had gotten wind of the story before she'd even stepped out of the cockpit, thanks to a leaked report from a junior officer who'd seen the crates loaded. By the time she was in handcuffs, escorted to a holding room, the headlines were already screaming, "Rogue pilot defies orders to save thousands," and F-22 hero or traitor. Sarah didn't read them. She didn't need to. She'd seen the parachutes land, the people running toward them. That was enough. The hearings were brutal. She sat in a stark room, flanked by lawyers she barely knew, facing a panel of officers who looked at her like she was a puzzle they couldn't solve. The charges were serious: unauthorized use of military equipment, violation of international airspace, conduct unbecoming. But Sarah didn't flinch. She told the truth, plain and simple. "I saw people dying," she said. "I had the means to help, so I did." Her honesty didn't erase the consequences, but it shifted the narrative. The public latched onto her story, especially in the US, where people were hungry for heroes who broke the mold. Social media exploded with hashtags: "Some blaze for Varnja," "Raptor rescue," and petitions demanding leniency. Veterans groups rallied, calling her a patriot. Aid workers shared videos of Varnja's recovery, of children eating, of clinics reopening. Even some of the brass off the record admitted they admired her guts. Colonel Reed testified on her behalf, his voice steady as he described her skill as a pilot and her character as a person. "She made a choice I couldn't," he said. "I'm not saying it was right, but it was human." In the end, the Air Force compromised. They couldn't let her walk free, that would set a precedent, but they couldn't ignore the lives saved either. Sarah was discharged, her record marked with a reprimand, but no prison time. The F-22 was grounded for weeks, inspected for damage it didn't have, and the incident was quietly buried in classified files. But the ripple effects didn't stop. Her flight had embarrassed the politicians' stalling aid, and within weeks, cargo planes were landing in Varnja with UN escorts. The famine wasn't over, but the tide had turned. Sarah moved back to Ohio, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. The Air Force had been her life, but it wasn't her home. Home was the fields, the people, the quiet moments where she could hear herself think. She took a job teaching science at the local high school, where her stories about engines and aerodynamics made kids' eyes light up. She didn't talk about Varnja, not at first. It felt too big, too raw. But the kids had a way of pulling it out of her, asking questions about the scars on her hands from a rough landing in training, or why she looked at the sky like it was an old friend. One day, a student named Mia, a shy girl with a knack for physics, brought in a newspaper clipping about the Varnja flight. "Is this you?" she asked, holding up a grainy photo of Sarah climbing out of the F-22. The room went quiet, every eye on her. Sarah smiled, a little sad, a little proud. "Yeah," she said, "that's me." She told them the story, not as a hero, but as someone who'd seen a wrong and tried to make it right. The kids listened, rapt, and when she was done, Mia said, "You didn't let anyone stop you. That's what I want to be like." That moment stuck with Sarah. She started speaking at community centers, then schools, then conferences, not to boast, but to share what she'd learned. That kindness wasn't weakness, that selflessness could move mountains. She wasn't polished. Her voice cracked sometimes and she stumbled over words. But people listened because she was real. She talked about Varnja, about the pilot who'd escorted her, about the team who'd risked their careers to help her. She talked about how one choice could spark a chain reaction, how humanity could triumph over fear. Tom proposed to her a year after the flight in the middle of a rainstorm because he said it felt right to ask when the world was a mess. They got married in a small ceremony, Jinx as the best man, Emily giving a toast that made everyone cry. "To Sarah," she said, raising a glass, "who taught us that rules are important but people are everything." Jinx, true to form, added, "And who owes me a beer for not getting us killed." Life wasn't perfect. Sarah missed flying, the way the F-22 felt like an extension of her body, the way the sky opened up above the clouds. Sometimes she'd wake up from dreams of afterburners and turbulence, her hands reaching for controls that weren't there. But she found new ways to soar. She volunteered with Emily's nonprofit, helping plan aid drops in other crisis zones. She mentored kids like Mia, who went on to study aerospace engineering. And she kept in touch with Anna, whose letters came every few months, filled with updates about Varnja's recovery and her own dreams of becoming a doctor. One spring, Sarah got an invitation to visit Varnja. The famine was over, the region stabilizing, and the people wanted to thank her. She hesitated. Travel wasn't cheap, and she wasn't sure she could face the place that had cost her so much. But Tom, ever practical, booked the tickets. "You need to see it," he said, "not for them, for you." The trip was a blur of color and sound. Varnja was no longer the desolate place from the briefing photos. Fields were green again, markets buzzed, and children ran through the streets laughing. Sarah met Anna, now a teenager with bright eyes and a quick smile, who hugged her so tightly it hurt. "You're why I'm here," Anna said, and Sarah had to look away to keep from breaking down. At a community gathering, the elders gave her a woven bracelet, a symbol of gratitude. They told stories of the day the crates fell, how families had wept with relief, how strangers had shared what little they had. Sarah listened, her throat tight, and realized this was what her mother meant about kindness being its own reward. It wasn't about recognition. It was about connection, about reminding people that they weren't alone. When she returned to Ohio, Sarah felt different, lighter, like she'd left some of her doubts in Varnja. She kept teaching, kept speaking, kept pushing for a world where no one had to steal a jet to save lives. Her story inspired others. Pilot in Europe who flew aid to a flood zone, a doctor who smuggled medicine past a blockade, A kid in her class who organized a food drive. Each act was a thread, weaving a tapestry of hope that stretched across borders. One night, years later, Sarah stood in her backyard, the bracelet from Varnja on her wrist, the stars above her as bright as ever. She thought of the F-22, of the moment she'd pushed the throttle and chosen to act. She thought of the people who'd stood with her, and the ones she'd never meet but who'd been touched by her choice. The world was still messy, still broken in places, but she'd learned something undeniable. One person with enough heart could change everything. And that was enough to keep her going. One kind act at a time.